As many of you would probably already be aware, that Dr. Saul, he is an inventor, an engineer, an entrepreneur, specialising in clean and renewable energy technologies. He has founded a dozen, or at least a dozen, technology companies in Silicon Valley over the past 20 years. Saul is also the author of 3 books, and you probably saw a few of them, or at least 2 of them, on the way in here. The Big Switch, and there's also the quarterly essay as well as Electrify too. Recently, he's switched his focus from, the other lab, which is his independent research and development lab, to doing more work around policy and writing, and we're certainly maybe some of the recipients here of that. And so this includes starting up that non-partisan organisation of Rewiring Australia, Rewiring America, and you've also got Rewiring New Zealand, is that correct as well too? Yeah, he's very busy. But still, he's come here to be with us this evening. So can you please give Saul a very big Gold Coast welcome?
As a dad joker myself, I feel challenged to respond. Excellent. And I made it up on the spot, so be warned. What do the solar modules say in coal country? I'm a hard sell. So tonight's talk is also going to be new material while they find my slides. I'm actually on a 3-leg trip that winds me up via Brisbane, Montreal, New York. But it's Climate Week in New York, and we are trying to raise money to rewire the world because hitherto there hasn't really been an environmental movement for the centre, if you like. The environmental movements traditionally shut things down and chain themselves to gates, and I think that's great, and we need people protesting, cutting down trees. But we also need climate action in the broad middle of society, which is how do we really get to zero emissions, meeting people where they are, and so that's what Rewiring the World will be. Shamelessly, that's a little bit about a big macroeconomic argument we're trying to win with the world's economists, and today is going to be fresh material, hopefully not too boring. That's going to be a lot about economics, but I'll explain why as I go. Also, amazing that we're talking about wonky things like electrification on a Tuesday night and we filled a hall. So thank you. As a nerdy engineer, I think that's great. So hopefully my people, they've said you have 25 minutes so many times. Hopefully they didn't count that bit. Now I'm going to reset my timer. Here we go. So just so you don't have to read the books, Electrify was a love letter to Joe Biden or whoever was going to win the 2020 election in the US on what the US would need to do to really do a wartime level of effort required to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. While I was working on that, and then that precipitated the start of Rewiring America, I realised that Australia has actually got a bunch of fundamental advantages. That means we could go first and fastest on climate action, which kind of would be a nice way to atone for our centuries of sinning. So the Big Switch was sort of electrify for, what do they call them, thought leaders or something in Australia. Then I realised it's a really good community story to sell, so I really like the essay and the quarterly essay. If you only read one, read that, because I think if we're going to win climate, it's through telling stories about how the future is better, and that's a story about how Australian communities can improve. And right now I'm 3 weeks overdue on what you might call Electrify for Tradies, which is coming out this year, which I'm pretty excited about. That wasn't really meant to be a buy my book thing, but if it looked like that, I'm sorry. So I started a thing called Rewiring America in 2019. We thought we were just going to help the candidates in 2020 talk about climate change more positively. It wound up for me getting a fist bump for all of a second and a half with this guy on the White House lawn. This was the launch of the Inflation Reduction Act. This was the policy team for Rewiring America. The 2 guys in the multicolored shirts, they actually worked for a guy called Chuck Schumer. They introduced the Inflation Reduction Act. That's the largest piece of climate legislation. We had a hand in writing as much as a third of that, about $100 billion plus worth of incentives. I think this is a good idea, obviously, but I'm just going to say it a little out loud because we're trying to get the Australian government to be this ambitious, or hopefully more ambitious. And this is broken down into what it is, what the Inflation Reduction was. So about 40% of it was for zero emission incentives to make zero emission electricity. Another 40% was incentives for, they call them, so that's the supply side, the first bit I mentioned at the bottom, the yellow bit. The demand side is where we use energy, not just where it comes from, but where we use it. So that's the vehicles, that's the homes, that's the heat pumps. So we wrote an awful lot of that. And then the top bit is mostly how do you manufacture those things. $400 billion sounds like a lot. It's also not nearly enough. But the cool thing about the IRA, and this is what we're promoting with the Treasurer's office and the Prime Minister's offices and the Energy Minister's office, is you can make federal money go a long way. So if you got an incentive for an EV in the US for $3,000, you had to spend 30 grand of your own money, so you get $10 of private capital deployed for every dollar of government capital. You can go through every bit of the IRA and actually see that it's going to commit more than $2 trillion, and that was from the original estimate, but it's actually going to deploy at least 3 times that because it's really popular. And Australians, like Americans, we love tax cuts, so we should do policy like this. This policy was explicitly designed to permanently transform the energy landscape in America to get it to the point where electrification was cheaper and better than running the economy and running households on fossil fuels. In fact, this is my house in San Francisco. The day the IRA launched, we launched this calculator. I qualify for $33,000 in incentives, and you can see what they're for: to buy solar, to buy EVs, to buy heat pumps, to buy water heaters, to buy all of the pieces of kit required to get to zero emissions. All right, so that's some good news from America, which you all need right now, I suspect. Sorry, I lived in America long enough I can make tasteless jokes. This is the bad news part of the evening. This is from the AR6 IPCC report. These are all the pathways, and they've modelled thousands of pathways, but they've highlighted 4 of them to achieve 1.5 degrees Celsius as the goal, the Paris goal. As you can see, nearly all of them go through the horizontal line in the middle. That's 0. That means they are all relying very heavily on negative emissions. In fact, most of them rely on more than 10 gigatons of negative emissions per year after mid-century. To put that in perspective, 10 gigatons is how much coal, oil and gas we pull out of the ground every year. So not the scientists who did the IPCC report, but the economists and lobbyists who came in after permitted the idea that we would build an industry larger than the 3 world's largest industries combined to bury a negatively priced product later this century. It's never going to happen. What that really means is this. So on the left, that's how much fossil fuel you can burn if you want to hit 1.75 degrees without negative emissions. And on the right, that's how much if you want to do it, with negative emissions on the left, without negative emissions on the right. We can do negative emissions with trees, and we should do a whole bunch, but that's probably 1 to 2 gigatons a year. So we put in 10 times that in the projections. Why did they do it? Because the value of the oil that they can burn, those negative emissions, is worth about $37 trillion at wholesale or $300 trillion at retail, meaning at the petrol pump versus as a barrel of oil. So we've just given the fossil fuel industry somewhere between $30 and $300 trillion to fight against us on the way out. That means net zero 2050 kind of isn't good enough, and we need to continue to push harder and push government harder for 2040 actual zero. So that brings us to Rewiring Australia. We could do that. We're not yet showing the ambition required. This chart is all of Australia's emissions. Below the dotted line is all that we emit, not here. It doesn't even count under the IPCC against us. This is our coal and our gas being burned in other economies. Everything above the dotted line happens domestically in Australia, but I've broken into 2 things: domestic emissions and trade emissions. So fully 40% of the emissions that count against us are using fossil fuels to get all of that other stuff to market in other countries, or it's beef that we grow here that is consumed in another country, but those emissions go on us. Those 2 categories don't really go away until we stop our fossil fuel export. So we need a good economic story for later this century, which I think there is. But if you really think about emissions, and you saw how rapidly those emission reductions have to happen, you've got to focus on what we can do now. So I want to focus tonight mostly on those top 2 things: households, which is your cars and all of your appliances, and commercial things, because these are things where technologies exist today. You can't go out and buy a green iron facility yet. You can't go out and buy a green hydrogen facility. Those things that might happen next decade. So how do we meet our emission target this decade? We've got to smash those domestic economy things, our households, our small businesses. So it's actually 42% of the domestic economy come from decisions you make at the kitchen table. What fuels your car? What heats your home? Where does your electricity come from? It's another 29% if you include small businesses, because about 29% of our emissions come from how small businesses heat their businesses and what vehicles they drive. So it can be very impactful. It's all about electrification. It really is our only strategy to electrify these sections of the economy. That's what the whole theme of the book Electrify was about. We also have to supply it with clean electricity, so that's what the wind farm jokes and the solar panel jokes are about. But the extraordinary thing that you can now say, which we couldn't say 10 years ago, is that this electrification will cut your energy use by more than half. Same leaky Australian house, same oversized Australian car, same opulent lifestyle. You can have it all at half the energy cost. So the efficiency we were looking for 50 years with the reduce, reuse, recycle mentality is actually electrification. It can also improve your health, meaning we won't be burning the fossil fuels that are the leading cause for respiratory illness and responsible for as much as a couple of million deaths a year globally. And it can lower your energy bills. That sounds too good to be true. But here's how you do it. On the left, that's an average Australian household today, 120 kilowatt hours per day. Average Australian household is 2.7 people, 1.8 cars, probably 180 square metre home. You can see the biggest block of the energy use is petrol or diesel, followed by gas or LPG for their heating, followed by the thermal energy losses of burning coal or burning gas to make your electricity. If you electrified the vehicles, electrified the heating systems in the home, supplied all with green renewables that don't have those thermal losses, you'd only need 32 kilowatt hours a day. So that's a pretty extraordinary thing. So again, same size cars, same size homes. I haven't even double insulated your windows. So you could do a little bit better. Just to emphasize the economic impacts of this, so here's, that's Australia's favourite car on the left, Ford Ranger. 80% of the energy is wasted as heat on the engine block. You can buy a Rivian ute in the US. It looks like that one on the right. It'll probably be coming here next year. It uses a little less than 1/3 of the energy from the Ford to go the same distance. These are the distances this is how much energy for the vehicle use in every home in every state. You guys drive a lot, as you can see, although if you're competitive, you've got to drive more because the Northern Territory's beating you. If you drove, so that's the petrol car for the average, paying $2 a litre, that's the average petrol bill for one car. If you drove an electric car paying the most expensive electricity, a fast charger at 60 cents, you'd still save money every year, $2,000. Off the grid, it'd be $1,000 a year. With some mix of rooftop solar in the grid, it's probably about $700 a year. That's probably the most reasonable one to use. And it now means actually owning an electric car over its lifetime would be cheaper. So for the 15 years lifetime of that Ford Ranger running on petrol, it would be $95,000. And if you did that electric equivalent running off some mix of solar in the grid, it'd be about $70,000. We have, even though the grey, you can see the upfront cost is the grey bit, it's still 10 or 15 grand more expensive or 20 grand more expensive for a big electric car than the equivalent sized petrol car, but you make it up in maintenance and in energy costs. Same is true for water heaters. This is the portion of heat of your energy use for water heaters in houses. Queensland, looks like you take a lot of showers. Hopefully that's because you surf a lot. And again, you can do the economics of that. So gas instant or LPG instant, those are the first couple of columns. Really, you want to look at the last three: electric heat pump or electric resistive running off your solar, or best of all, electric heat pump using solar. You could smash those annual energy bills. This is those lifetime costs again. It's going to be more than half if you do it right compared to running on the LPG, the gas. Also true for heating your home, not so relevant in Queensland, although you're about half heat, half cooling, as you can see. Northern Territory's all cooling. You probably don't want to think about moving to Vic or Tas, it's all heating. But for the average Australian home, again, now heating with electricity, well, you can see with LPG or gas, it's pretty high. And these heat pumps now and heat pumps with solar, you could just smash your bills by $1,000 a year on the heating. Again, 15-year price times. You can sort of see the trend here. It even works for your cooking. Turns out electric induction cooking uses half the energy of gas. That results in it being cheaper per year and cheaper over its lifetime. And then, of course, not wasting energy generating with coal and gas on the left there, but generating with clean electricity. That's where the other energy win comes from. That's the extraordinary thing. Energy use goes down 60+%. Our electricity use is going to nearly triple. That's okay, because I just showed you that even though electricity will triple and you currently think of as electricity as expensive, petrol is far more expensive and gas is expensive. And so this is a net win. So we're going to have to continue to tell ourselves this story. Part of the reason electricity is actually not expensive, is cheap and is going to get cheaper, is the Australian rooftop solar miracle. So that's your traditional electricity bill broken down by all the components in the first column there, 28 cents. This is, you can tell this chart was made 2 years ago because inflation means that went up another 6 or 8 cents. I can see some people in the front saying, I wish I paid 27 cents. But what's more interesting to look there is actually more than half of the price, or about half the price, is the distribution and metering, right? And then the transmissions, the big transmission lines are a couple of cents. Even the environmental policies make it, and the retailer is charging you 3 cents for apparently pretending that they're competing with each other. Rooftop solar, the second column there, 4 cents a kilowatt hour, or maybe 5, depending upon what financing deal you get for it. You could add in a battery, and depending upon how well you use your battery, it's either the third or the fourth column, still cheaper than the grid. And we could have a fifth category here, except it's illegal under the Australian Energy Regulator, which is the fight we're fighting, which is for community renewables to play a big part. This means the economics have turned the corner. So when I was giving this talk in 2022, I was like, oh, in the future, by 2024, it'll be cheaper if you're paying finance for all of these electrified things instead of for all your fossil fuels. But we've actually crossed that Rubicon, and now we know that Australian households would all save. Better than that, it's actually anti-inflationary. I was in New Zealand a few weeks ago when we launched a white paper with the head of the Reserve Bank in New Zealand, and we showed this chart. So that's the 30-year history of the total cost of running a household in terms of its energy costs. So that's your petrol, your gas, and your electricity. You can see it's inflated just about at the same rate as CPI, or a little faster. The amazing thing about solar cells, you buy solar cells, you're buying 25 years of electricity up front, you're fixing the payments into the future on an interest plan, and so you're taking that volatility and that inflation out. So there's one version of why the Inflation Reduction Act is called the Inflation Reduction Act, which is that we got this slide in front of Joe Manchin, who was holding up, which is true, but it might just be because he wanted to lower the price of drugs and have it not be called the Biden plan. I like my version better. All right, anyway, back to the community. We got to go fast. And so what I'm trying to build here is an argument for the Australian government to get over its neoliberalism and understand that if we loan money to Australians and if we provide the right incentives, Australians are very good at adopting solar. We've done it better than anyone in the world because it turns out real people are just as good economists as the people who run the Reserve Bank. We all made the right choice. Let's help more people make more of the right choices and make more finance available. And that means we can smash this. So if I ran the idea of let's get every Australian household to all electric by 2040, running all their vehicles, etc. And this sounds fast, but actually this is the natural rate of replacement. Your average car lasts about 20 years, the average water heater lasts 12, the average space heater lasts 15. So you're going to leave, I don't want you to leave the hall thinking I have to go home and buy all these things tomorrow. I want you to go home thinking I'm anxious about climate change, I want real climate action, and I've got to make 5 good decisions in the next 15 years. So the next time your car goes, that's a good time for it to be electric. The next time you're doing a reno, it's a good time to put in the electric kitchen, etc., etc., etc. If you can afford it, you'll save more money by doing it faster, so by all means. But let's work together as a nation on making the policies, making the support, so that everyone can afford it. Anyway, if we all did it at that rate of replacing all of our fossil fuel machines every time they break with an electric one, Australia would be saving $62 billion a year just for our residential household economy by 2040. Or we'd be saving, that's $600 billion by 2040, and if you take the curve through to 2050, it's close to $2 trillion. So this is a Jedi mind trick we're trying to pull on Australian economists to be like, actually, probably half of Australian households aren't doing these things, not because they can't afford it, but because they don't have access to the credit facilities to enable them to do it. So the problem with the Inflation Reduction Act and all those tax incentives is they're great. 50% of people pay tax, roughly in any society, 50% receive tax benefits. So the poorest 50% of Americans won't get access to all of those great incentives in the US. And I'd like to think that Australia, or at least Australia used to be a fairer country than the US, hopefully it still is, that we could be more ambitious in our policy and not just go for tax incentives, but figure out how to help finance everyone. I think the youth of Australia are desperate for a story that includes them in it politically. Here's a good one. We'll save you money, we'll invest in you, we'll invest in this project that'll create a huge number of jobs. And wouldn't that be nice? Anyway, hopefully someone here is, actually I know someone here is a politician. They just won in the council electorate of the Shire, Scott Morrison's old electorate, a young guy. If a young guy can beat Scotty, someone in Scotty's electorate, then the youth can win it nationwide. That'd be good. All right, so the story is really good for a household, average Australian household. Once you get to there, and even including the cost of financing, will save $3 or $4 grand a year. Adds up to a really huge number for the country, but I want to sort of make it more personal. So what does it look like in a community? So this is my suburb. It's just south of the young man in the Shire, just north of Wollongong. We're very average in terms of many things, average age, et cetera, It's part of the postcode 2515. You'll notice that includes Coaldale. At my local surf break, there's a coal seam that goes all the way into the water. So and when I first moved, went for a walk in the forest with my wife. She's like, "What's that black rock on the ground?" I'm like, "That's coal." And she's like, "Shit, Australia is made of it," which it is. So we don't need to dig it all up. Anyway, average town. This is the subunit of the electricity grid. It's called a zone substation. That's the machine I sketched there on the right. You've probably seen one on the wrong side of the railway tracks somewhere around your town. One of those typically supports about 4,000 households. We're about 4,000 households, so we are the national, not only are we average in terms of income and household demographics, we're average in terms of our substation. The Wombara substation's up there where the star is. My house is about in the middle. So there's the 4,400 households that are connected on 5 strings under that substation. What do those households do today? Every year we spend about $15 million a year on fossil fuel. So there's one petrol station in 2515. As I like to say, they sell you 3 things that can kill you. They sell you nicotine, they sell you sugar, and they sell you petrol. But those $15 million creates approximately 1.5 jobs at the servo. And that's money that leaves your community and doesn't get spent in community, doesn't circulate in community. We spent another $5 million on the grid electricity spend. Again, this is 2022 numbers, so this is put 25%, put the Putin inflation on all these numbers. What we could do tomorrow is still spend some money buying electricity, because no community can really go off-grid. I'm not advocating that everyone goes off-grid. We need each other to make the system balance, so that occasionally my car cooks your dinner and occasionally your solar charges my battery. But if we spend, we'd have to spend about $1.5 million a year on local electrification labour to do this by 2040. That would actually be about 25 jobs. That's pretty significant in a 4,000 person community that's got about 1,200 people in the workforce. It'd nudge 2 or 3% of employment. But we would actually save about $22 million a year. That's on the maintenance, that's on the cost of the equipment, and that money, the reason I put 400 jobs there, classic economic theory will say that in Australia, 55% of discretionary household spending is spent in your local LGA. So people would take the money that they're not shipping out at the petrol station, and they'd be buying coffee, and they'd be buying art, and they'd be buying local tradie services. And just think about what happens. So that's one postcode, $20 million a year. Your surf club will be gold-plated within a decade. The bolo will never look better. Price of a schooner might go down, finally. But this is the economic story that is possible if we really embrace the agenda. What's exciting is that Australia, for the reasons we have a mild climate, we have excellent solar, we we import all of our oil, and our gas is expensive, and our electricity is relatively expensive compared to the rest of the world because we're so big. Those actually turn out to be the 5 advantages that mean economically Australia is at the finish line before nearly any other country in the world. And so the reason I'm telling you this story here is we're trying to get communities to start telling the story. We know that 18% of people who buy solar in Australia buy it because their neighbour said it was good, which is better than Instagram ads do at helping you buy solar. We also know that we won't get the political pressure we need on the government that gets an awful lot of political pressure from the oil and gas industry unless we make communities central to the story. So we need public demand. So we're trying to build a movement. Hopefully that's why some of you are here tonight. And then really we're trying to change the international narrative, which is why I'm going to New York to rewire the world. There's probably about 100 countries out of the 220 that sort of list where they've gone through this economic transition. Turns out countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, Australia. So if you don't make your own oil, if you're somewhere near the equator, very likely the economics have flipped. Why does this not sound familiar to you? The people, including some of the economists who work with the IPCC modelling, only think about the wholesale price of energy. So the people who stand up and say, oh, it's too expensive to do this renewables revolution, that's because they're comparing renewables to wholesale gas or wholesale coal. But no one here buys wholesale gas or wholesale coal. We all buy energy at retail. This goes against traditional climate advocacy, which is like, let's stop the heaviest emitters first, which traditionally means industry and the electricity industry buying coal. They buy energy at wholesale. So we're trying to solve the most expensive, most difficult first, which means we're not prioritising the emission reductions we can do this decade in all the countries where it can start to save us money. So hopefully we're kicking that ball rolling. There you go. Put a thing on your lawn. Take 15 years to check all the boxes. If we all do that, we win. Thanks, and that's Saul Griffith for Rewiring Australia.